Today I have with me again in Femke Hovinga. She was on episode 35 where we discussed bore out versus burnout, and it was a really great conversation. And we're having her back today to talk about thinking errors. Femke is a social entrepreneur and researcher from the Netherlands. She works in the world of the gifted with a special focus on 145 plus IQ and designs psychometric instruments focused on the gifted group. So,
Yeah.
good morning and good middag, Femke.
Oh, good. You've been practicing your Dutch. Well,
Yeah.
Andre, thank you so much for having me again. It's a pleasure.
Well, great. I can't wait to get onto this conversation because the presentation I saw you at the 2E conference, and then based on our last conversation, episode 35, you brought up the point about thinking errors. And I
Yeah.
wanted to expand on that because with my experience with cognitive behavioral theory, not theory, behavioral therapy, CBT, we talk a lot about that, but not those terms. And you have a different perspective. And I think the listeners would be very good. Be very good for the listeners to have this conversation. So, what, in your terms, what are you talking about thinking errors?
So thinking errors are, well, it's a pretty descriptive term to say it like that, but it's things you sort of mess up in your head. So you don't need to make it that complicated, or you don't need to think in a certain direction, but because you have a certain pattern in mind, you start doing that anyway. So an example for that is black and white thinking. So it's all or nothing. I need to do it 100% right, or I better not start doing it at all.
Mm-hmm.
Or a mental filter, which is something like paying attention to only the positives or the negatives, depending on your attitude towards things, or thinking that you always know what others will feel when you do something specifically or don't do something specifically. So basically, it's getting ahead of yourself all the time in your head. And as an ADHD person, I suppose most of you will probably recognize that anyway. But if you're also uh, kind of prone to doing those thinking error type of thinking,
Mm-hmm.
then you may get stuck in your head.
Now you said something about it creates filters. It could
Mm-hmm.
potentially create filters. So if we only want one certain thing, we may just
Yeah,
the thinking error could be tweaking that thought into what could support our filter.
definitely. So if you feel anxious about, for instance, flying, taking an airplane, and that's the worst thing you could ever think of, then what you are going to do is put all your thinking errors, of course, you don't do that on purpose, but all your thinking errors were geared towards what's the worst thing that could possibly happen. And you're going to get things very much out of proportion. So the chances of a plane crashing, which is the thing most people are very afraid of because you're losing control the moment you take off, is super small. It's like one in a few million airplanes, I think. And then always there's a reason for it too. So it's rarely anymore random that airplanes come crashing down. So the chances are super tiny. But in your head, those chances will be enormous. So they will be out of proportion, and you will start thinking, like, hey, if I get on, I will be that one in a million type of plane. And the fun thing is that we don't do that the other way around, because chances of winning the lottery, for instance, are, well, in the same type of ballpark, but we never go like, oh, I really, really, really feel that I am winning. We all realize that chances are so small we are going to win. So typically you only use those thinking errors, while not being aware of that, in situations where they are not very helpful. So they're going to put you in a certain direction and filter your ideas towards that. And sometimes will prevent you from taking actions that you otherwise would take. Or, for instance, they sort of are in the way of building your self-esteem or self-concept, because
Mm-hmm.
you're always thinking what others may be thinking, or you're disqualifying the positive things, or you're crystal ball gazing, so looking at whatever may happen in the future and how people would respond to that then in a scenario X, Y, and Z. So you're always ahead of your game, which is in a way a quality, but in this way it's sort of a challenge, because you stop yourself from being open to experience and trying new things, and you cause anxiety for yourself.
Okay, I like those are two great examples. Flying, which is very, very safe, or the lottery, which is it's never works for you, rarely.
Yeah.
Um, I think I just want to reframe that a little bit. So what I kind of heard, what not kind of I heard, I did hear it was if we got these thinking errors slash filters, then very small things that support this filter get amplified because
Yeah.
there you're going to jump on it because it supports your belief or theory. So these filters at the same time are what we could call kind of our core beliefs or an internal beliefs that may be right or true.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the point that you said it prevents you from taking action, and it could be a good or bad game that it's supporting. I think is
Mm-hmm.
a good point. And I think it's very important. And you're right. I think with the ADHD mind, negative rumination is very predominant with us, disqualifying the positive. It's very easy. And when you said that, I got like a flashback of many, many examples of when that happened.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great point to point out also that it also creates anxiety, which
Mm-hmm.
is very prone for the ADHD brain too.
Yes, definitely.
Um, okay, I guess we just kind of talk how to, personally, professionally, relationship-wise, how these thinking errors can have. Um, how can be, and you brought up awareness. I really like about that. So I want to make sure the listeners understand we're always going to have thinking errors. We can't get rid of them.
Absolutely.
So that makes sense to you?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And being aware is more or less try to catch the fact that we're in a thinking error as soon as possible and getting out of it.
Well, depending on how you look at it, because we all have our thinking patterns. Each person comes from a different background culturally. Like I'm from the Netherlands, you're not, so you don't know our local traditions here, for instance. So perhaps my thinking errors are based more on our local culture because our culture is please behave normal and don't do anything crazy. Whereas if you grow up in a country where you're really enthusiastic about excelling, so getting good grades in school or going for great achievements, then it's going to be a whole different ballpark for you to, live in. So then it won't be so bad to do something really well and stand out. So it doesn't really matter what other people think of you when you stand out. Whereas here, it works the other way around. So it's always context dependent, but also it helps us because the thinking errors are patterns in our brain that try to help us judge situations. And we all need them because you need to be able to judge whether you run away when you face a tiger or whether you go out to pet it. I mean, you don't want to go pet it because you have an instinct that, hey, that's not a good idea. So in a way, we all need those patterns in our minds and in our systems. But thinking errors, well, the word implies that errors is that doing that a bit too much. So rather than making a judgment or creating an idea for yourself, you're overthinking it and you're starting to lead by your thoughts rather than using your thoughts to lead you. And that's the other way around. So they can be helpful as long as you're aware of them. And what I often see in coaching people is that when they're aware of their thinking errors and what they are, it often becomes quite funny because, it's sometimes can be quite ridiculous if you really try to spell it out. What are the odds of crashing with your airplane in comparison to walking down the street and getting hit by a car, or even getting killed by a coconut falling on your head, or stroked by lightning, or whatever else you compare it to? Then people will go like, yeah, no, nah, it can't be that bad. But you need to know that you're making a thinking error in order to reflect on it and learn from it.
Correct. Yeah.
And especially, I mean, this is a very provable point, right? We can just look at statistics and we can be like, okay, so it's 1 in, I don't know how many million. So yeah, you're safe. But if you have the more sort of gray shades of thinking errors, such as overgeneralizing, so seeing one negative event as an indication of everything being super negative all the time, then what is what? I mean, you look at it through sort of a gray set of glasses, but is it really so? Or is part of it so? Or you don't have those statistics. So then you really need to zoom into the situation, whether it is a thinking error or whether it's a contextual thing. And the therapy you talked about earlier is one of the things that will address that. However, when we see people here in our practice with ADHD minds or gifted minds or combined minds, gifted and ADHD, then we see that they have so many things going on in their heads and so many, things they think of at the same time, but also scenarios, ideas, and at the same time making a list for their grocery shopping. And well, I don't know what's going on in all those minds, but they're all over the place, and it can be really hard to pinpoint it by just a cognitive approach.
I
So what we
agree.
try to
Yeah.
do is to tell people what thinking errors are, because it's really useful to know. Whatever your background is, it's good to recognize that you may have such patterns going on, and then looking at what's in their situation. Because ADHD or gifted minds, if you're going to do cognitive behavioral therapy, you're going to go through a protocol of steps that are very cognition based. And while it may work for some gifted or ADHD people, our experience is that it doesn't work so well, because they're typically a step ahead in their creative process, or in their problem solving, or problem creating, or five thinking errors at the same time. I don't know what's going on, but typically that doesn't really suit. So the thinking errors are a good departure point. And from there, you basically just have to look at the person you are when you're listening to this, or who you're working with, if you're a coach or whatever you do.
Right.
And then try to reflect on it and go from there.
You just explained overgeneralization is a type of thinking errors. Can you list off a couple other different types of thinking errors?
Yeah, sure. So it's well, I started off with the black and white thinking. Well, that's pretty obvious. We all know that type of expression, like, hey, it's not black and white, there's something in the middle there. But it's something we do quite unaware in thinking that it should be either perfect or we don't do it at all. I mean, perhaps you know procrastination behavior in yourself. I sure do. And this is one of the reasons we see that most. So we only want to do it if we know that we can and that we should, and that the pain and the gain is high enough to actually go ahead and do it. So that's black and white thinking. The mental filter, as I mentioned, is looking only at one specific part of something. So for instance,
mono filter.
The mental filter.
Oh, mental filter. Sorry. Yeah.
There's my Dutch accent. Yeah. So noticing only your failures or the negative things, rather than seeing what's going well and what successes you're having. Then the next one is disqualifying positive things, which is kind of in line with that, but you pretty much throw them out in the beginning rather than just filtering. So you're doing something that's really well. So perhaps you need to write a report at work, for instance. You hand it over to your boss and you're like, oh, well, yeah, I did it in just a few hours. It can't be any good. And your boss is really positive about it, but you sort of don't believe it because it can't be right, because, you know, whatever 15 reasons are behind that, and you feel like an imposter and you disqualify it in advance. Then there's mind reading. So mind reading is a way of thinking that you know what others are thinking of or feeling. And now the thing is that sometimes people are actually really good at that. So that's another sort of gray area type of thinking error. But the problem arises when you start doing that as a departure point. So you're gonna base your actions on what you think another person would think of that. And in a way, it's again something we all need to do because you don't want to hurt people purposely. But if you just do your own thing, not with an idea of hurting or doing anything bad to somebody else, then you don't need to be thinking about what others will experience all the time. So that's another one. So it's mostly in relation to others and how you measure against other people or in interaction with other people. It's rarely about something that's only in your head, other than scenarios that are about things like flying or whatever other thing is out of control. So I think control is one of the mechanisms that you start to lose if you dive into thinking errors. So do you want to hear any more? Because there's more, but we can also...
I think there's that. I think that really, those are the top ones. And
yes,
I guarantee you, disqualifying positive things, everyone who's listening just went, oh, yes.
Yes.
I know I did. Because when I actually met my psychiatrist the third time and I got diagnosed, he actually asked me if I was successful, and I said no. And he got me to list off, well, he
Yeah.
asked me all these questions. Do you have a house? I'm like, yeah, I do. What's your point? He goes, those are all good things. And I never
Yes.
saw them as that. And you're right. I have always disqualified positive comments, positive feedback. And in my case, it has to do with a lot. I don't trust the positive feedback because of my earlier trauma and past, but for other different people who all got different reasons. And the more ADHD entrepreneurs I talk to, especially high achieving ADHD
Yeah.
entrepreneurs and very intelligent ones, this will always, it always comes up in the conversation.
Yeah,
Like,
definitely.
whatever. Yeah, I did a good job. Yeah. It's not a big deal. What's the big deal? But now I'm starting to learn to just shut up and say thank you.
Yes. There's another thing though, like I find that when people do that, say, oh yeah, no, I'm not really successful, and you start listing stuff, and then they sort of have to be aware that they are in fact quite successful, then I always wonder what's behind them saying that. Is it that they
Exactly.
really don't believe in themselves? Or is it so that for them it's not successful because they can do way more? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's a societal way of looking at success,
Yeah.
and perhaps ADHD minds or gifted minds can achieve more than the bar that was set by society. But if you hit that bar that society set for you and you're like, oh, okay, apparently I'm very successful now. Well, thank you. I don't know. It's not really my definition of being successful or accomplished
Bingo.
or whatever.
Bingo.
Then you look at it just in a different way, and you never feel successful then because you're never at your own point of achievement you want to accomplish.
Perfect. And not at my level of achievement. And that's the thing. When we're measuring with someone else's stick, we never
Yeah.
feel that success because that's not what I wanted to do. That's not how I measure it. And then when
Mm-hmm.
I figured that out, I start to look at it differently. Now I do feel myself more successful because I'm not using other people's measuring sticks.
Yes,
I'm
exactly.
glad you brought that up because I think it's very, very important for the
Mm-hmm.
listeners to understand this. So
Mm-hmm.
if we're going to look at things positively, it's got to be in relation to our measuring stick.
Exactly. Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. I knew this was going to be a fantastic conversation. Um, so just to bring it back a little bit, so a lot of the thinking errors you're talking about in the CBT world, it's also called cognitive distortions,
Mm-hmm.
where it's actually your thought could be distorted based on the scenario. But I like this context of thinking error because it could be anything, not just related to emotions. Like CBT takes is actually what you're after, but
Mm-hmm.
it's you really pointed out that it really affects relationships. Even if you're afraid of flying, it can
Mm-hmm.
still affect relationships because you may not go somewhere to interact.
Mm-hmm.
But these thinking errors really affect relationships at the end.
Yeah, well, in fact, I think that most relational problems, whether it's in a love relationship or in a relationship between colleagues or whatever, I think most conflicts depart from, or at least have, are influenced by thinking errors. Because if there is a colleague, for instance, in your office who is always eager to help you, and he is very experienced and he's trying to well, I don't know, take his life lessons and help you with it. But you
Mm-hmm.
feel you're always doing something wrong because this older colleague is always coming up to you and telling you, perhaps try this, perhaps try that. So that older colleague could have the idea that he's doing a great job in being a mentor for his young colleague. And if your idea is, oh, every time somebody says something, I have to take it very seriously because I'm never good enough, and oh, something happened there down the line in our production process, but it's probably my fault because he told me I should do that differently. So you're going to take it all in.
Yeah. Can you just stop there for a sec? I think we got to
Yeah,
we have to let the listeners just catch up a bit because they're doing the same thing. And oh my God, I know what you're talking about.
sure.
Like, but it's true. The ADHD brain always does that. Oh, something went wrong. What did I do wrong? I still do
Yeah.
this. And I got to talk to you. Oh man, what did I do wrong this time? Right?
Yeah,
And
definitely. It
it's
depends also,
confusing.
I guess, on whether you were young when you were found to have ADHD or not. Where quite a few people find
Yeah.
out later in life, especially in our generation and above us. So then you have created a pattern with help of the context, of course, in which
Mm-hmm.
you're usually pointed at things that you've done wrong or have been too impulsive about or
Yeah,
been
you're not
doing
doing what
too
we
much.
normally do.
Yeah. So if you are very young when you are diagnosed, and it's a fair diagnosis because that's another discussion, of course, but
Yeah.
if it really is ADD or ADHD, then at least you have a new pattern to work on and work with, and people can help you with that if you're a young kid. Whereas if you are in your 30s, 40s, 50s, you find out you're going to have something to catch up with. And that may be as intense as going through a process of like grief, finding out who you actually are and what your
Yeah.
talents really are, and that your thoughts may be based on, partially at least, on thinking errors, and that you are in fact good the way you are.
Mm-hmm. So what I just heard there is you actually can create new thinking patterns
Oh yeah,
at any
definitely.
time. Cool.
Yeah.
We got a few more minutes here, but I'd like you to. There's a couple. One thing I want to talk. You to mention and talk about a little more. You use this term, focalism
Mm-hmm.
and affective forecasting, to what you what you referred to in the presentation as impact bias. Can you just
Mm-hmm.
quickly give a scenario? Because I just remember those were fantastic points.
Yeah. So what I tend to give as an example, and people always try to disprove me, is that if you go through a really good time in life, for instance, you do win that lottery, right? So you get your I don't know how many million prize. Let's say you get a 5 million prize, and they ring your doorbell and they go, "Whoa, you won! You're super rich now. You'll never have to work again. Woohoo!" Well, everybody will be like, "Oh wow, that's pretty cool." And the thing is, after, well, about a year, you're back to your own baseline of happiness. Same thing goes for something bad happens. For instance, we work in a hospital for pediatric oncology now.
Mhm.
So we have many, many sick children there, sometimes with pretty bad outlooks. And they researched whether their parents, their family, but also the kids themselves, how they felt and whether it actually became a traumatic situation for them, besides being sick in itself, but how they experienced it mentally.
Mhm.
And turns out a vast majority of all those patients and people surrounding them bounce back to their own daily happiness level
Right.
again after about approximately a year, which is very odd to me because both things are very impactful also on the course of your later life. But it really just, that's how it works. We adapt to whatever comes up and we work with that.
Then we
And
come back down.
whatever
Yeah.
we focus on, then, whether it's a negative or positive thing, and we tend to focus more on the negative things as a human being anyway, that grows. So everything you
Hmm.
give attention will get bigger. So the more often you look at your own pattern of, I'm afraid my airplane will crash, then the chances in your head will increase that it will actually happen. And you will see things in the news everywhere about mechanical problems or terrorist attacks, and everything will be related to that airplane coming down from the sky. And the thing you can do to reroute is actually hang in there, because our brain patterns are structured in that way that we build sort of roads in our minds. And ADHD or gifted roads are pretty fast and kind
Mhm.
of all over the place, but very efficient. So we built those, and even the negative outcome roads take a long time to build because you build your pattern based on context, your
Right.
character, etc. So if you want to change something, you need to build a new road. It's typically really physically how that works. So you need to practice, because that's the only way you can make new roads in your head. And you need to practice so
Right.
often that you can use that as a new pattern, because under stress, we're all going to do what we did before. You're
What's
not going
comfortable
to.
and what you don't have to
Yes.
think about. Right.
Yes, exactly. And that's your pattern. And you're, well, the road where you have two wheel tracks in there so that you're comfortable always on the same place.
So
That's what we're
retraining our
working.
brain to
Yeah.
create new habits and new patterns of thinking, but that takes work because we're actually
Oh, yeah.
physically changing the structure of our brain to
Absolutely.
do that.
So
I think
what do
that's
you
key
think,
for the
Andre?
listeners to understand. We can rewire our brain, but it takes effort.
Yeah.
There's no
What?
magic pill. There's no magic, let's go to Femke and she'll fix me. No, we have
That'd
a
be
lot
good,
to do
right?
with us. Yeah.
Yeah. So how many days, Andre, do you think it takes to change a habit?
Uh, everyone, there's a magic number of 30 days,
Uh-huh.
22 to 30. But I also think it also depends on what habit, how
Hmm.
much you really want to change the habit.
Yeah, definitely.
But I do have a belief that once a habit becomes very habitual,
Hmm.
subconscious, then that's what I call a routine.
Yes. Well, that's what those patterns actually are. And a relatively new study shows that it can take up to 66 days. But
Mm-hmm.
what you say is actually quite right because it it's not just a straight road there, but as we all know, it's like ups, downs, hill and downhill and
And jumping over walls, going through
yes.
ditches.
And I think after about a month, if you persevere and you want to change, that you're quite far along the process, but
Mm-hmm.
then you're at risk of taking the wrong exit and going onto your old road. So
Yeah.
you need to train your brain that that road has now been built and you need to use it. And that's what happens in the next, well, days, weeks after it.
So that's how we can fix thinking patterns. Sorry, this is how we can fix thinking errors by changing our thinking patterns, by creating
Yeah.
these new habits. It's not just habits of waking up early, just be habits of how we deal with different things and scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
That's why
Yeah.
I've always looked for the trigger. What's really triggering these issues, and it fixes a
Yeah.
crap load of symptoms at the same time. So,
Yeah,
wow,
good to
this is
understand,
yeah.
but you need to start small.
But
Small
you got to
example.
do something. It takes
Yes,
work. You got to do
definitely.
something, and you got to stay on top of it. You can't just coast. That's the big thing I learned is you just once you figure it out and it seems to be working, you can't coast because you're like you said, you take the wrong exit, and that
Mhm.
exit is old habits,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
right? So, wow, there's a lot here to unpack for the listener here. Thanks again, Femke. I really we could have talked for another hour or two for sure.
Yes.
But the three things I want the listeners to understand here is like you said about thinking errors, very small things that support your filter or that thinking error will get amplified and seem a lot worse than it is. I really like the discussion about there's thinking patterns that's based on cultural, environmental, and personal beliefs, I guess you can say,
Hmm.
which can also is either related to thinking errors or help with thinking errors or separate of thinking errors. And you create new thinking patterns by rewiring your brain, but it takes work, it takes
Yep.
effort, and it's not easy. That's why that's why it's always hard. One of my core values is always take the hard road because I
Hmm.
know at the end it's more growth, it's hard work, but the easy road I usually find it doesn't work out well. So what I want you, the listener, to take away from this is that thinking errors will happen. You can't get rid of it. You never go for perfection. I'll never think about it. But the key is being aware, as Femke mentioned earlier, to notice them and to stop them in their tracks. But that takes effort, that takes coaching, and it takes true, honest look at yourself to see what these are and be honest. So remember, progress is not perfection. Sorry,
Yes.
progress, not perfection, is what we're after.
Hmm.
So, and then the one question I want the listener to think about is, are you aware of your thinking errors? Your thinking errors at home, at work, and even with your friends? I'd like to hear from you. Are those questions? What are your answers? You can send me an email, andre@andreb.ca. I'd like to keep this conversation going with you, the listener. So thanks again, Femke, for a great conversation as usual.
Thank you.
And to you, the listeners, thanks again.
Thank you, Andre.